My name is Mike Tyler, and I'm from cmm.world. And we're here with Andrew Brunson and Norine Brunson, his wife.
We want to thank everyone who prayed for us. It was so important to me in prison to know that people were praying for me. It's something I always asked Norine about. When she was able to visit me, I'd say, are people praying for me? And she'd say, yes, they are. I was always concerned that it would stop because my imprisonment went on and on. But every time she saw me, she said, people are still praying, people are still praying. And this was such an encouragement to me. So it sustained me in prison. It also brought me out of Turkey. But there was also a lot of prayer that went into Turkey and is blessing that nation. And we're so grateful to everyone who prayed for us.
Yeah, we definitely felt the support from this family and the prayer coming from here. George would be in touch with me on a regular basis. How are things going? We're praying for you. And so we're really grateful. Just want all of you, all of this community to know how grateful we are for the prayers.
So thank you very much.
Yes.
We're grateful.
That's great. I just want to go back to the beginning somewhat. I just want to know now, for people that, and the students and family of CMM, not everybody knows your story. So I just want to go back a little bit from and talk about what you were doing in Turkey at the time, and what led up to your arrest, Pastor Brunson.
Okay, so we went to Turkey as missionaries in 1993, and we'd been there about 23 years when we were called into a police station. We thought we were going to collect our residence papers, permission to live there, long term, and instead they told us they were arresting us to deport us from the country. So up until then, we'd been involved in church planting and started a house of prayer. And the most recent thing we'd been focusing on was refugee work. A lot of Syrians came into Turkey because of the war there, civil war. And we thought this is a great opportunity to reach them with the gospel, people who had been inaccessible before. And so we were ministering there for years among Muslims, trying to bring the kingdom. When they called us in and said they were going to deport us, we were shocked. We believed that God had told us in 2009 that our assignment was to prepare for harvest in Turkey. And so we thought, Lord, are you cutting this short now? After so many years preparing here and ministries that we thought had potential and were developing, to have that cut short, it was very surprising to us. Then we found out that the Lord wasn't cutting short the assignment. Right. My time in prison was actually preparing for harvest, because I became a magnet for prayer from all over the world. People started praying. The Lord raised up supernaturally. We can see God started it, He sustained it, He drove it, and basically an unprecedented prayer movement focused on one person started up. And this was really to draw prayer into that country to bring about the harvest that He had assigned us to prepare for.
Did you have any inclination that you would be called in and be arrested and be accused of what they were, brought you in for?
Well, we didn't expect that because it hasn't happened to anybody else. I'm the first person who's been arrested in Turkey for his faith like this. And so we assumed, there is persecution, things can happen, but for missionaries especially, this hasn't happened. People have been arrested before and deported, but no one has been held the way I was. And also I was accused of being a terrorist, of helping to plan an attempted coup in 2016, of being a military spy. So no, we didn't expect that. That was a surprise. And you would ask why were we held? I think that they intended to deport us, to expel us from the country, but then somebody decided to keep us and see what could happen. I think that they wanted to intimidate other missionaries and have them self-deport. They wanted to intimidate local believers and local pastors. And the idea is, if we can do this to an American, we can do it to anybody. And so I think that's what they were using us for. They held us together for 13 days, and they released Norine, and then they held me for another 2 years. And so then at some point it became, they started to use me to try to leverage me to gain concessions from the states. But there was also a spiritual motive behind it the whole time.
So, Norine, they released you after 13 days. You go back home, and your children are there also in Turkey
They
now?
were not. They were in the States.
They're
They
in the
were all
States.
stateside. The two oldest were in college, and the youngest was in high school
Okay.
with Andrew's parents. And I was so grateful that they were far from the situation, that they were safe, frankly. Yeah.
So you go back home. You have a home in Turkey.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And did your church family come around you?
Absolutely. And they had been praying away for us during all this time. A lot of prayer had been going on. It had just hours of worship and prayer. And the Christian community in Turkey is quite small. And so, news traveled very quickly when we were arrested. We actually went in. They called us into the police station. We thought we would be deported. We thought we were getting our long-term residence permit.
Right.
And then they said, no, you're being deported. So even that day, as the news was coming out and we had our phones, we were able to let people know, hey, please pray for us. They want to deport us. We were saying, no, this is our home. We want to stay here. So the prayer had started immediately. And yes, they absolutely gathered around us.
So I'm sure you felt that strength and that
Yes.
encouragement and comfort coming from the congregation, your church
Absolutely.
family. But at the same time, your husband's now in prison. What thoughts were going through your mind and emotions?
It was so, the day before I was released, he had talked about how, one of his fears was that we would be separated. We were glad that we had been held together for those days. Probably I was the only woman in that place, and they had put us together apart from everyone else. So we were that was a relief. But we didn't know if that would last. As time went on, it became clear something else is going on here. So he had just brought up how one of his fears was that we would be separated. And then the next day it happened. All of a sudden they released me with no explanation, no sense of what is my status now. Am I free to go home and remain in Turkey? Or am I being released and I will have to leave in a little while? It was just very, very unclear. And what would happen to him? Would he also be released or not? So there was just so much uncertainty. That was a difficult part.
Wow. So you didn't know the next steps, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Immediately met with a lawyer and tried to see, what is my status now? Do I still, what's going on with me? How long can I stay here? What can we find out about him? But there was at that point, they were holding us in, what's it called? Not legal detention, but, administrative. It doesn't matter. It wasn't actual prison. We were in this limbo situation where we couldn't get information.
Wow. So were you able to go to the embassy, the U.S. embassy, and?
Yeah, I contacted them immediately. Of course, they had already known about this, and we had been prevented from seeing them during these 13 days. But then at least I was able to be in touch with them, and they didn't know anything either. They were trying to find out things from the Turkish government themselves. Right. Yeah.
So it's kind of like you were in like a limbo situation
Yeah.
still, even on the outside
Yes.
of the
Yes.
prison. Yeah.
Yes.
Andrew, in that first few days, did you think you were going to be, after she was released, did you think you were going to be released also shortly after
I
that?
hope so. I knew that there was something unusual, something wrong going on, because normally if they were going to deport someone, they'll do it in a day or two, especially for an American. So when they refused to give us any information and they kept holding me, I hoped they would release me, but it hit me in those first few days when I was alone and I was in solitary confinement, that there was a very powerful spirit holding me. And so I just suddenly became aware, well, there's something very powerful going on here, and I did not know how it would be resolved. So I had a lot of fear.
How long were you in solitary confinement for?
About 50 days. 50 days. That time. And at a second time later on, but that time 50 days. And it was very difficult.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So it was incredibly hard, to go back to your question, to leave him, knowing that this was a fear that he had, and we didn't want to be separated. We didn't know what was going to happen. At the same time, it was better for me to be able to be out and start contacting people, and someone can actually do
Well, I
something.
wanted her to be out because I said, fight for me.
Right.
Then I knew that there was someone who was outside who could, deal with our children and who would fight for me and try to get me out.
That was one of the hardest things when we were held. We couldn't get news to anybody. We didn't know if people knew where we were, or, especially our kids. We were just, we couldn't see anyone.
Yeah.
So.
The Bible talks about loving your enemies. Did God give you the grace while you were in prison to love the guards, love inmates that maybe didn't like you, that you were held with?
Yes, I had.
I was going to go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, while you were thinking about your answer, I was going to say, I still have to, there is one guard that I still have to stand in forgiveness. He was just the look on his face, the way he talked to us, some of the things, he was just very unhelpful. And I would try to specifically go in and say, Lord, I choose to bless him. I choose to, forgive him. And
So it's a choosing.
yeah.
Or would you say it's
Absolutely.
or would you say that it's you got to ask God for that grace to love?
Yeah, sure.
Well, then
Sure.
choose.
Sure.
I think the thing that comes to my mind isn't love as much as forgiveness. I guess forgiving is a demonstration of love. And I didn't have there were a number of false witnesses against me, people who I didn't know, or also people who had professed faith and were in the church but had left the church, or were just full of envy or resentment for different reasons, and gave false testimony against me. But I also knew that their testimony was not really what was keeping me in prison. And when I went on trial, I knew that under normal circumstances, a prosecutor, a judge would never have listened to them because they were baseless things. So really I knew that the people keeping me there, persecuting me, were very high up in the Turkish government. And so I had to forgive the false witnesses. I had to forgive those who were accusing me. But
And you did so in court
I did
publicly.
I did so
As a
publicly,
witness.
but it wasn't that difficult to forgive them, even though they were, had very bad intentions, were malicious. I struggled much more to forgive the political leaders who were very cynically using me, who were lying about me, and manipulating things. They were the ones who were really keeping me there. I did forgive them, right, but those are the ones that I really had to press into forgiveness for. Right. And here, forgiveness, obviously it's a punctiliar thing. You make a decision, you decide I'm forgiving, right, I declare forgiveness, but then there's a process of working it out, that I had to forgive again and again and again until it goes deeper into my heart.
And keep standing in it.
Yes.
Yes, I'm still, Yes,
Yes, absolutely.
And it was forgiving them for what they're doing to me, but they were also hurting my family, and so...
There's a bigger picture.
Yes.
It wasn't only about you.
But it's something that I had to do. We were required to do it. And I did this also in court publicly, forgiving people, making a declaration of forgiveness, because, it was an opportunity to have a witness as a Christian. So I was happy to be able to do that.
Right. Did you get to share the gospel with other inmates while you were in there?
I did. I was, after I was in solitary confinement, they put me into a high security prison, and I was in a cell that was built for 8 people, but there were over 20 of us crammed into that cell, and you stay in that cell 24/7. You don't leave the cell in the prison I was in. So it was very tight quarters, it was very intense, and I had many opportunities to talk about my faith. The reality is, though, that the people I was with were all very strong Muslims, and they were there because they were accused of being part of an Islamist movement. And so they were they were evangelizing me, you could say. They wanted to share their faith with me. I shared mine with them. But there was some tension at times. I was able to share with them, but what would happen is they're pressing into Islam because they think if I pray more, if I do my religious duties, then Allah will release me. So that's the way to gain His favor. So they were more intensely pressing into their own religion. So
outwardly, there wasn't any openness.
Yeah.
Who knows how God will use this?
Right, exactly.
I still pray
The seeds were
daily
planted.
for his last
Yeah.
cellmate. Yeah.
Yeah. Seeds were planted, though.
Yeah.
That's important. Conversations we had before when Dr. George Pear was here and Dr. Nancy Daniel, you said that you were always a seeker of His presence, of Jesus' presence. When you were in prison, was there a time where you didn't feel like, you felt like He was just far off, like He wasn't even close to you at all? I mean,
So the answer starts with saying I pursued God's presence for years, starting in 2007 especially. This was our main value, is intimacy and seeking God's presence. And the various ministries we were involved in, so there's an activity, but the goal of each of our ministries, what we were aiming for, was to seek God's presence in them. And I'd had a number of experiences with the Lord, of His presence. So when I went into prison, I assumed, well, I'm going to experience His presence in prison, and I'm going to be filled with joy. I'll have supernatural strength, at least the feeling of it, and I will sense grace. I'll just be covered with a grace. And yes, it will be difficult, but and that's not what happened. And I was really surprised. I think I had an idealistic view of suffering from persecution that came probably from reading books and biographies, things like that. Actually, the sense of God's presence was removed for the 2 years I was in prison. Also, hearing His voice, I was very confused, and it felt that God was silent. So, having come from that emphasis for years on the Father heart of God, His tenderness and His presence and presence of Holy Spirit, to feeling like I'm now in darkness and feeling abandoned, it's what took me into a crisis of faith. So I knew that persecution can come, and I was being persecuted. I didn't like it, but I knew that it could happen. That's not what took me into crisis. What took me into crisis is that while I'm being persecuted, I felt abandoned by God. Now, I wasn't abandoned, but He removed that sense of presence for those 2 years. That was very, very difficult.
okay, so you said you knew that He didn't remove His presence, but it felt like it for those 2 years. What, in your heart, what kept you moving forward?
Well, I didn't move forward all the time.
Okay.
I very much regressed. So I came from being a missionary who had been faithful for a number of years, and I thought was a relatively seasoned, tough missionary, because we'd been through difficulties. And then going into prison and finding out that prison was way beyond my strength. And I broke. And I had many doubts. I had many questions. A lot of them having to do with, where are you, God? Have you abandoned me? Where is your voice? And a number of other things. So I broke pretty badly, and I broke repeatedly. I was suicidal at times. Now, I thought maybe I was the only prisoner. I mean, I've heard of all of these in biographies or about the Chinese who are so courageous. And I thought, what is wrong with me? I've learned since getting out of prison that there are a number of people who have had the same kind of experience I did, who have some light at certain times during the experience, but for the most part, experience silence of God and a feeling of abandonment. And so it seems to be a common thing for people who are suffering persecution. I don't understand why, but I do know what some of the results are, is that I think God allows us to be tested. I'm not saying that He is the one who is causing those circumstances, but He uses our difficulties and He tests us. He gives us difficult assignments sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot what your
But
question was.
your faith wasn't lost.
It
Your
wasn't.
faith wasn't lost. I mean,
It wasn't. It was definitely tested and shaken, and I was broken. And then there was also a process of God rebuilding me.
And at times, he feared, turning away from the Lord. Would that be fair to say?
I feared that, not that I wanted to in any way deny the Lord, but I thought in the circumstances I was in where I was very much cut off. I was, cut off, I say, by culture and language and life experience. I was only American there. But much more difficult, I was cut off with my faith. I was the only Christian there, surrounded by Muslims, and the environment I was in was a very highly intense Islam. And it was 24/7. There was prayer or chanting of the Quran or teaching of the Quran going on nonstop in my cell. And so the spiritual environment for me was very oppressive. In that environment and being cut off from other believers, the only believer that I met with during those 2 years was my wife, and that was for a time I didn't see her at all. At the beginning I was completely cut off. I didn't know what was happening. Then we had one visit a week eventually that was put into place. She had to get permission from the capital city of the country every week to be able to see me. And that was, through a reinforced glass on telephones. So there was no physical contact, and it was a very short time. And so that was the only spiritual input I had. So being cut off from other believers, and when I'm having doubts, not having someone to speak truth to me or correct me, especially in the early months, I thought, Lord, am I going to lose it? Sometimes I thought I was going insane, and I also thought, can I remain in You? Can I keep my faith alive in this very high stress environment that I'm in? So I was afraid. Yeah. Now, the Lord sustained me through it. He took me through. I say there was unfelt grace. There was a lot of grace, but I didn't feel it. Yeah. But as I look back, I say, when I see how badly I broke, how weak I was, then I see that He brought me through. And especially in my second year, there was a turning point where there was a rebuilding that started. Yeah. And that required my cooperation. There was grace, but it was very much my cooperating with that grace and taking deliberate steps to fight for my faith.
Talk about rebuilding. What do you mean by rebuilding?
Well, I had broken. I had many questions and doubts. I had accused God of many things. I was very weak spiritually. I was suicidal. Yeah. And then there were a number of times I would fall, go very, very low, and then start working my way back to God. I just tried to cling to Him. And then have some bad experience again, or be disappointed again, and be broken, and then try to start working my way back to Him again. But there was a turning point when I was transferred to a maximum security prison from the high security prison I was in. And I made a decision. I realized that there was very little I could do to fight for my freedom by that point. But that I could fight for my relationship with God. I could fight for my faith, because I could feel myself just drifting from the Lord, and I was so much in despair. Yeah. But I made a decision, I'm going to start fighting. I'm going to fight for my faith. Yeah. And then begin to take deliberate steps to focus myself on Him throughout the day, to take my doubts and questions and, well, actually I imagined a lockbox, and I opened it, and I put my questions and doubts in, and then I locked it. And I said, God, you and I are the only ones who know how to open this lockbox. We're the only ones who have this combination. You can open it any time you want, but I'm choosing not to. I will not open. I'm making a decision. I will not open this box until a time when you're ready to deal with me on these and answer questions or heal me or however you're going to do it. And I said, I don't need to have the answers to my questions to have a relationship with you. And so it was a very deliberate step of the will. And after that, when these questions and doubts would come up again, I would not think about them. I'd say, no, you stay in the box. So that, until then, I had been suffocated. My questions and doubts were suffocating me. I couldn't receive. When Norine would speak truth to me, when I'd read the Bible, there would always be, well, here's the truth. And my answer was, yes, but. You know, I couldn't receive it. And when I put those doubts and questions away, it began to loosen up again in my heart, and so that I could receive from the Lord. There were steps like that. So there were steps of the will to focus myself on Him.
To speak the truth, to declare the truth.
To declare the character of God, for example. I questioned whether He was truthful with me, whether He was faithful, whether He was good, and whether He loved me personally. I know that He loves His people in general, but what about me personally? Am I just an expendable, pawn in His kingdom building? Right. And I had really questioned His character on those. So I came to the point, I'm going to declare the truth about God. Whatever my circumstances are, whatever my perception is of my circumstances, I'm going to declare that you are good, that you're faithful, that you are true, and that you love me. So, and then declaring it regardless of my feelings, again and again and again. So there were these disciplines that I started. Right. And another very important one, when I'd been fighting for my faith for a month or so, and then I was called into a court session, and the charges against me were raised to a point where they had an automatic 3 life sentences in solitary confinement. So I thought, here I've been fighting for my faith, trying to get close to God again, focus on Him, and now I see the Turkish government is declaring openly they want to keep me in prison for life. And it knocked me down. I was really discouraged. But after a few days, I was up making my declarations again, pressing into God. I need to press into you. I need to hold on to you. And I ended up, there was a song that I wrote 2 weeks after I received those basically life sentences, and just crying out to God, saying, you are worthy of my all. You're worthy of whatever sacrifice, of whatever pain and suffering I go through. There's one of the verses says, I want to be found worthy to stand before you on that day with no regrets from cowardice, things left undone. To hear you say, well done, my faithful friend, now enter your reward. Jesus, my joy, you are the prize I'm running for. So the key for me was those two first sentences where I'm saying, I want to be found worthy to stand before you with no regrets from cowardice or things left undone. I was thinking, if I stand before Jesus, when I stand before Jesus, because I will someday, and what if He shows me, Andrew, I had these assignments planned for you. I had these things I intended to accomplish through you. There was an inheritance I had planned for you. But because of cowardice, you left them undone. Yeah. I thought, what a terrible thing it would be. I'd be full of regret. And I started to say, Lord, I'm even if my assignment means prison, if that is your plan for me, I want to. Don't look at my feelings, look at what I'm saying, what I'm declaring. With my will, I say, I want to serve your purposes. I want to fulfill every assignment you have for me, even if it means remaining in prison. My feelings, I sure don't want to be in prison. I want to be back with my family. Right. So there was a daily battle that began where I'm fighting through my fear and my despair and grief that I wake up with in the morning, and fighting through to a point of surrender and saying, God, if this is your assignment for me, then help me to embrace it, to fulfill everything you have for me. And then I achieve a measure of peace, as much as I could in those circumstances. And then I wake up the next morning with fear, despair, and grief, and I have to begin the fight again, that fight through to surrender, to focusing myself on eternity, on fear of God, saying what matters is not how much I suffer here, but eternity, and focusing on that, fighting through to that again. So day after day, the same battle, because yesterday's victory did not really carry over to the next day, but over a period of time, there was a gradual upward trajectory. There was still a battle, but it became, I don't know, it was still difficult, but a bit easier to move into that point of surrender. So when I say rebuilding, it was these steps that took me from brokenness to a determination to press into God.
Amen. Norine, I got to ask you this question because what was your, say, the second year of his imprisonment, what was your faith like with God, your relationship with God like?
I was surrounded by other people. I wasn't the one behind bars.
Right.
He was behind bars.
But you were out there fighting.
Yeah,
for
definitely,
him,
definitely. I was doing everything I could, both diplomatically and trying to keep the prayer going. And
like, God, what are you doing, God? Was that any?
Yeah. So you come to a point where you think, wait a minute, we thought we knew a lot of things that God was showing, but this has gone a very different direction, and kind of all bets are off. And you think, okay, what do you have for us, Lord? Right. Much of the time, I thought he would eventually be released, that because God had things that he was still going to... We have so many prophetic words about things that God wants to do, wants to use us in. And I said, well, those haven't been fulfilled yet. We haven't done those yet. So he has a future outside of prison, things that have to be fulfilled outside of prison. But that doesn't deal with the timing, So could he be in prison for 15 years and then God, just quickly works and does things? Yes, it's possible. We didn't know about the timing. And that was one of the difficult things, because he would always ask, when do you think do you think I'm going to be released? And God would give me even more certainty sometimes that I, felt in those moments to say, yes, I think so.
Yes.
But I don't know when.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But he'd say, do you think it's going to be, the fall? I really struggled. How do I answer him? Because I don't know. I want to give him hope. But what do I know? So it was I really, really struggled with how to best encourage him.
Were you getting prophetic words about his release? Were you anybody like any?
Sure.
People from like okay.
Sure.
How did you deal with that? Like the struggle with those prophetic words and.
So that's a whole area that would take a long time to go into, but it was difficult. I think that in those, probably in circumstances like that, people want to see him released, and you think, oh, God is showing this or that. There's probably a mixture going on during those times. So when we had prophetic ministry from here, for example, I would say, please don't even tell them who we are. I don't want them to even know, if possible, who they're prophesying to, just to get it a more pure thing from the Lord. And I think there was a complication with the prophetic ministry. Was very much, prophetic words were really tested. This whole thing was very tested during the prison time. The prophetic has been huge for us, very important, very, very important over the years, and it continues to be. But it was really tested, and I think that there were times when, in fact, there was a release that was on the agenda, and God said, in a sense, He was saying to us, I will keep my word to you. But if you're willing to step back and to release this,
I'll keep my word to you and
to
release you.
at this time. But if you're willing to submit this date, this time, I will do something greater. And there were a few times that there were things that indicated something like that could be going on.
When did you get to a point where you thought, all these, millions of people are praying for me for my release, and then you thought, well, this is bigger than me?
Oh, yeah.
When did that happen? Like,
Fairly early on, actually.
For me, later on, as Norine told me how the permament was growing, it was kind of scary actually, because I thought, okay, now I can see how God is using my imprisonment to draw all of this prayer into Turkey, and I believe this is going to transform. It's creating the conditions in the spiritual realm so that then there can be a great move of God. And I started to think, well, the way for God to cause us to grow even more is to keep me in prison longer in more difficult circumstances that will generate more prayer. So I thought I'm more valuable to the kingdom in prison than out, more effective. How long will He keep me here?
but still, that was a daily fight, like you were talking about before.
Sure, but obviously, I was very glad to see that there was at least began to get a glimmer, of what God, of some of the things that God could be accomplishing.
But to be honest, when you're in it,
I don't care that much about what He's accomplished.
you think, okay, there's going to be a reward in heaven, and you feel like, God, I'll pass on that. Just get us out. In the moment, you just want release.
Right.
Honestly.
So, what is next on the horizon for y'all? I know you're writing a couple books, right? Or you writing?
Well, there's a book coming out in October that tells the story, basically. It's a memoir about the 2 years in prison. I'd like to write another book that deals more with the teaching side. What are the areas I was tested in, and how did I come through? What's on our horizon is that our heart is still in missions. We have a missions call focused on the Middle East, and we want to see churches planted. So I don't think that we will lead hands-on at church plants anymore. We did a number of church plants in Turkey. I think that now the Lord is focusing on us on how do we help the next generation of church planters. So with mobilizing, equipping, helping them on the field. But we want to see, we believe that there's going to be a powerful move of God in Turkey, and that what happens there will then affect the countries around it. And so we hold on to that, the word God gave us to prepare for harvest, that there will be a harvest.
And that we will see it.
Yeah. And I think that actually this imprisonment, I'm not a very important person at all. I wasn't doing much. I was just trying to be faithful and hold on in prison. But God was using that to start this massive prayer movement that is going to, I rode a wave of prayer out of Turkey, but there was a tsunami of prayer that crashed into Turkey. And that's going to accomplish, the purposes of God to bring a great harvest in Turkey, and then it's going to spread to the region. So we're waiting to see that.
Yeah.
And when he, in the book, Andrew's very open and honest about breaking and about his weakness. He says, my testimony is going to be of my weakness. My
This is what the
weakness
body
and God's
needs.
strength.
The body needs
Sure.
that.
My weakness, God's strength.
Yes.
And as somebody, a pastor in Denmark, was pointing out, here you were, Andrew, at your weakest in prison at that time, and yet God was doing this amazing work worldwide for the sake of Turkey. There's just the contrast. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I just felt like what you said before in the conversation, way back in the conversation, about unfelt grace. I felt like it would be a great book title.
Yeah.
Unfelt grace. That's good. I just want to thank you all. Thank you for your time. Thank you for spending time to go through this interview.
We just are so grateful to the whole CMM family for praying for us, and we say this is really, we want to give a call to people for missions. This is the time for the Muslim world. As he said, we are expecting harvest in Turkey. The Lord has said it's on his agenda, and I think more clearly now people have seen this. Those who have really noticed that this was a worldwide prayer movement centered on Turkey. There's something amazing coming that the Lord is, that you all have already sown into. So consider joining it further.
Yeah. Thank you.